Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. And we have seen what the basic story is so far. This is the story of a war that has erupted in the cathedral town of Barchester between Dr. Prouty and his wife and his chaplain, Mr. Slope, who are newcomers to the parish, and or to the diocese, I should say, and the Archdeacon Grantley, and Mr. Harding, the warden, the ex-warden of the previous novel, and a whole bunch of other in the Grantleyite faction. They locked horns almost immediately. As soon as the bishop got there, his wife, and his chaplain, Mr. Slope, were berating Archdeacon Grantley for the shape, the condition, the so-called dilapidations of the bishop's palace, as if Dr. Grantley were a plumber or a stonemason. They were giving him laundry lists of things that were wrong with the property that the old bishop had allowed to just, go to heck. This naturally rubbed Dr. Grantley the wrong way. Dr. Grantley is a very imperious person, and war was declared. And in the course of that war, to pursue it, a living that Dr. Grantley had in his gift came open, and he convinced a friend of his named Mr. Arabin to come there and fill that place at St. Ewald's. Mainly because Arabin is known as a fighter, as a debater, as someone who would be very useful in the fight against Mr. Slope. And that's where we are now. Mr. Arabin went out to Plumstead Episcopi, the home of Dr. Grantley, to meet the family and to talk and whatnot. And the next day, Mr. Harding and his daughter, Eleanor Bold, are scheduled to go out to Plumstead Episcopi themselves to talk over matters about who is going to get the wardenship of Hiram's Hospital, but also to talk about other things as well. They're all going to go out there, and an extra day was necessary for them to wait because Eleanor already had an appointment with the Stanhope family. Another churchman named Dr. Vesey Stanhope, but also his children. His alluring but crippled daughter Madeline, his common sense daughter Charlotte, and his ne'er-do-well son Bertie. And at that meeting, at that little friendly family gathering that was mainly just for chess and tea, Mr. Slope showed up. Now, we saw in the chapter that we read that Mr. Slope showed up mainly to fawn over the crippled but alluring Italian daughter of the Signora Neroni, who's actually, her name is Madeline, and she's, English, but she became an Italian seductress in all the years that the family spent in Italy. He mainly went there for her, and was a bit surprised that Eleanor Bold would show up, especially awkward because he is intending to conduct a campaign of wooing Eleanor Bold in order to get control of the £1,200 a year that she has under her own name. But nevertheless, even though that would be awkward, Eleanor had a wonderful visit. She had a wonderful time with the Stanhopes and left thinking they were quite the nicest family she'd ever met. And now, she and her father are arriving at Plumstead Episcopi. So that is the chapter that we're reading now, which is chapter 21. When Mr. Harding and Mrs. Bold reached the rectory on the following morning, the Archdeacon and his friend were at St. Ewald's. They had gone over that the new vicar might inspect his church and be introduced to the squire, and were not expected back before dinner. First we've heard of the squire. Get a lot more of that later on, but Mr. Harding rambled about by himself and strolled, as was his wont at Plumstead, about the lawn and around the church, and as he did so, the two sisters naturally fell into conversation about Barchester. Dr. Grantley's wife, is another of Mr. Harding's daughters, so she and Eleanor Bold are sisters. There was not much sisterly confidence between them. Mrs. Grantley was 10 years older than Eleanor, and had been married while Eleanor was yet a child. They had never, therefore, poured into each other's ears their hopes and loves, and now that one was a wife and the other a widow, it was not probable that they would begin to do so. They lived too much asunder to be able to fall into that kind of intercourse which makes confidences between sisters almost a necessity, and moreover, that which is so easy at 18 is often very difficult at 28. Purely wrong. Trollope might have believed this and definitely lived that way. Most people believe this and definitely live that way, that after you're in your 20s, you can't make new friends, but it's purely wrong. Mrs. Grantley knew this and did not, therefore, expect confidence from her sister, and yet she longed to ask her whether in truth Mr. Slope was agreeable to her. Everyone in this circle believes that Mr. Slope is pitching woo to Eleanor Bold. She's the only one who doesn't seem to know it. It was by no means difficult to turn the conversation to Mr. Slope. That gentleman had become so famous at Barchester, had so much to do with all clergymen connected with the city, and was so specially concerned in the affairs of Mr. Harding that it would have been odd if Mr. Harding's daughters had not talked about him. Mrs. Grantley was soon abusing him, which she did with her whole heart, and Mrs. Bold was nearly as eager to defend him. She positively disliked the man, would have been delighted to learn that he had taken himself off so that she would never see him again, but indeed almost was afraid of him. And yet she constantly found that she felt to be unjust imposed. Okay, let's start that whole sentence over from the start. In fact, let's go way back there. She positively disliked the man and would have been delighted to learn that he had taken himself off so that she should never see him again, had indeed almost a fear of him, and yet she constantly found herself taking his part. The abuse of other people, and the abuse of a kind that she felt to be unjust, imposed this necessity on her, and the last made Mr. Slope's defense a habitual course of action for her. From Mr. Slope, the conversation turned to the Stanhopes, and Mrs. Grantley was listening with some interest to Eleanor's account of the family when it dropped out that Mr. Slope made one of the party. What? Said the lady of the rectory. Was Mr. Slope there too? Eleanor merely replied that such had been the case. Why, Eleanor, he must be very fond of you. I think he seems to follow you everywhere. Even this did not open Eleanor's eyes. She merely laughed and said that she imagined Mr. Slope found other attractions at Dr. Stanhope's, an allusion to the signora. And so they parted. Mrs. Grantley felt quite convinced that the odious match would take place, and Mrs. Bold was convinced that an unfortunate chaplain, disagreeable as he must be allowed to be, was more sinned against than sinning. The Archdeacon, of course, heard before dinner that Eleanor had remained the day before in Barchester with the view of meeting Mr. Slope. That isn't true, but still, and that she had so met him. He remembered now how she had positively stated that there were to be no guests at the Stanhopes, and he did not hesitate to accuse her of deceit. Moreover, the fact, or rather presumed fact, of her being deceitful on such a matter spoke but too plainly in evidence against her as to her imputed crime of receiving Mr. Slope as a lover. I am afraid that anything we can do will be too late, said the Archdeacon. I own I am fairly surprised. I never liked your sister's taste with regard to men, but I still do not give her credit for... And so soon, too, said Mrs. Grantley, who thought more, perhaps, of her sister's indecorum in having a lover before she had put off her weeds, than her bad taste in having such a lover as Mr. Slope. Well, my dear, I shall be sorry to be harsh, and to do anything that can hurt your father, but positively neither the man nor his wife shall come within my doors. Mrs. Grantley sighed, and then attempted to console herself and her lord by remarking that, after all, the thing was not accomplished yet. Now that Eleanor was at Plumstead, much might be done to wean her from her fatal passion. Poor Eleanor! The evening passed off without anything to make it remarkable. Mr. Arbon discussed the parish of St. Ewald with the Archdeacon, and Mrs. Grantley and Mr. Harding, who knew the parsonage and the parish, joined in. Eleanor also knew them, but she said little. Mr. Arbon did not apparently take much notice of her, and she was not in a humor to receive at that time with any special grace any special favorite of her brother-in-law. Her first idea on reaching her bedroom was that a much pleasanter family party might be met at Dr. Stanhope's than at the rectory. She began to think that she was getting tired of clergymen and their respectable, humdrum, wearisome mode of living, and that after all, people in the outer world, who had lived in Italy, London, or elsewhere, need not necessarily be regarded as atrocious and abominable. The Stanhopes, she had thought, were a giddy, thoughtless, extravagant set of people. But she had seen nothing wrong about them, and had, on the other hand, found that they thoroughly knew how to make their household agreeable. It was a thousand pities, she thought, that the Archdeacon should not have a little of the same savoir-vivre. Mr. Arbon, as we have said, did not apparently take much notice of her, but yet he did not go to bed without feeling that he had been in company with a very pretty woman, as is the case with most bachelors, and some married men, regarded the prospect of his month's visit at Plumstead in a pleasanter light, when he learned that a very pretty woman was to share it with him. Before they all retired, it was settled that the whole party should drive over the following day to inspect the parsonage at St. Ewald. The three clergymen were to discuss dilapidations, and the two ladies were to lend their assistance in suggesting such changes as might be necessary for a bachelor's abode. Accordingly, soon after breakfast, the carriage was at the door. There was only room for 4 inside, and the Archdeacon got up on the box. In other words, he got up on top, and the 4 of them sat right across from each other on the inside. Eleanor found herself opposite to Mr. Arabin, and was therefore in a manner forced into conversation with him. They were soon on comfortable terms together, and had she thought about it, she would have thought that, in spite of his black cloth, Mr. Arabin would not have been a bad addition to a Stanhope family party. Now that the Archdeacon was away, they could all trifle. In other words, he's up on top. He can't talk with them. They're all together. Mr. Harding began by telling them in a most innocent manner imaginable an old legend about Mr. Arabin's new parish. There was, he said, in days of yore, an illustrious priestess of St. Ewald, famed throughout the whole country for curing all manner of diseases. She had a well, as all priestesses ever have had, which well was extant to this day, and shared in the minds of many of the people the sanctity which belonged to the consecrated ground of the parish church. There's always a haunted well, is what Trollope is saying here. Mr. Arabin declared that he should look on such tenets on the part of his parishioners as anything but orthodox, and Mrs. Grantley replied that she was so entirely disagreed with him as to think that no parish was in a proper state that had not its priestess as well as its priest. The duties are never well done, said she, unless they are so divided. So you see, Trollope's not playing it up, but they are joking and joshing inside the car. So where Eleanor Bold is getting off thinking that these people aren't pleasant, it's the Archdeacon who isn't pleasant. This is fun. They're joshing with each other. I suppose, Papa, said Eleanor, that in the olden times the priestess bore all the sway herself. Mr. Arabin perhaps thinks that such might be too much the case now if a sacred lady were admitted to the parish. I think at any rate, said he, that it is safer to run no such risk. No priestly pride has ever exceeded that of sacerdotal females. A very lowly curate I might perhaps essay to rule, but a curatess would be sure to get the better of me. There are certainly examples of such accidents happening, said Mrs. Grantley. They do say that there is a priestess at Barchester who is very imperious in all things touching the altar. An allusion to Mrs. Proudie. Perhaps the fear of such a fate as that is before your eyes. When they were joined by the Archdeacon on the gravel before the vintage, they descended again to grave dullness. Not that Archdeacon Grantley was a dull man, but his frolic humours were of a cumbrous kind, and his wit, when he was witty, did not generally extend itself to his auditory. On the present occasion, he was soon making speeches about wounded roofs and walls, which he declared to be in a want of some surgeon's art. There was not a partition that he did not tap, nor a block of chimneys that he did not narrowly examine. All water pipes, flues, cisterns, and sewers underwent an investigation, and he even descended, in the care of his friend, so far as to bore sundry boards in the floor with an awl. In other words, he's doing to Arabin exactly what the bishop did to him, taking him to task about the state of affairs of the building that he has inherited. He doesn't seem to think that it's irritating when he does it. You will, at any rate, have a beautiful prospect out of your own window, if this is to be your private sanctum, said Eleanor. She was standing at the lattice of a little room upstairs, from which the view certainly was very lovely. It was from the back of the vicarage, and there was nothing to interrupt the eye between the house and the glorious grey pile of the cathedral. The intermediate ground, however, was beautifully studded with timber. In the immediate foreground ran the little river which was afterwards skirted the city, and just to the right of the cathedral, the pointed gables and chimneys of Hiram's Hospital peeped out of the elms which encompassed it. Yes, said he, joining her, I shall have a beautifully complete view of my adversaries. I shall sit down before the hostile town and fire away at them from a very pleasant distance. I shall just be able to lodge a shot in the hospital, should the enemy ever get possession of it. And as for the palace, I have it within full range. I never saw anything like you clergymen, said Eleanor. You are always thinking of fighting each other. Either that, said he, or else supporting each other. The pity is that we cannot do the one without the other. But are we not here to fight? Is not ours a church militant? What is all our work but fighting, and hard fighting, if it be well done? But not with each other. That's as it may be. The same complaint which you make from me for battling with another clergyman of our own church, the Mohammedan would make against me for battling with the error of a priest of Rome. Yet surely you would not be inclined to say that I should be wrong to do battle with such as him. A pagan, too, with his multiplicity of gods, would think it equally odd that a Christian and the Mohammedan should disagree because they are monotheists. He's saying it depends on your perspective. A Muslim will look at squabbling between two different denominations of Christianity and think it's insane. A polytheist will look at the squabbling between two monotheists and think it's insane. But you wage your wars about trifles so bitterly. Wars about trifles, said he, are always bitter, especially among neighbors. When the differences are great and the parties comparative strangers, men quarrel with courtesy. What combatants are ever so eager as two brothers? But do not such contentions bring scandal on the church? More scandal would fall on the church if there were no such contentions. We have but one way to avoid them, that of acknowledging a common head of our church, whose word on all the points of doctrine shall be authoritative. Such a termination of our difficulties is alluring enough. It has charms which are irresistible to many, and all but irresistible, I own, to me. You speak now of the Church of Rome, said Eleanor. No, said he, not necessarily the Church of Rome. You're bloody well right, not necessarily the Church of Rome. He's implying that the Church of England does not have a head. It certainly does. At the point when this novel was written, that head was Queen Victoria. Right now, sorry for you Church of England people, it's King Charles. No, he said, not necessarily of the Church of Rome, but of a church with a head. Had it pleased God to vouchsafe to us such a church, our path would have been easy. But easy paths have not been thought good for us. He paused and stood a while, thinking of the time when he had so nearly sacrificed all he had, his powers of mind, his free agency, the fresh running waters of his mind's fountain, his very inner self, for an easy path in which no fighting would be needed, and then he continued, What you say is partly true. Our contentions do bring us some scandal. The outer world, though it constantly reviled us for our human infirmities, and throws in our teeth the fact that being clergymen we are still no more than men, demands of us that we should do our work with godlike perfection. There is nothing godlike about us. We differ from each other with the acerbity of common to man. We triumph over each other with human frailty. We allow differences on the subject of divine origin to produce among us antipathies and enmities which are anything but divine. This is all true. But what would you have in its place? There is no infallible head for a church on earth. This dream of believing man has been tried, and we see in Italy and Spain what has come of it. Grant that there are and have been no bickerings within the pale of the Pope's church. Such an assumption would be utterly untrue, but let us grant it. And then let us say which church has incurred the heavier scandals. Oh, where he's getting this. The king, or queen, is the head of the Church of England. There was a quiet earnestness about Mr. Arabin as he half acknowledged and half defended himself from the charge brought against him, which surprised Eleanor. She had been used all her life to listen to clerical discussion, but the points at issue between the disputants had so seldom been of more than temporal significance as to have left on her mind no feeling of reverence for such subjects. There had always been a hard, worldly leaven of the love either of income or the power in the strains that she had heard. There had been no panting for the truth, no aspirations after religious purity. It had always been taken for granted by those around her that they were indubitably right, that there was no ground for doubt, that the hard uphill work of ascertaining what the duty of a clergyman should be had already been accomplished in full, and that what remained for an active militant parson to do was hold his own against all comers. Her father, it is true, was an exception to this, but then he was so essentially anti-militant in all things that she classed him in her own mind apart from all others. She had never argued the matter within herself or considered whether this common tone was or was not faulty, but she was sick of it without knowing that she was so, and now she found to her surprise, and not without a certain pleasurable excitement, that this newcomer among them spoke in a manner very different from that which she was accustomed. You get down, baby? Want to do some 3D yoga? Huh? Oh, there we go. It's not much today. She's very limber. We had a very long walk. Let's see here. So she's surprised and happy with what she's hearing. We're going to talk about what she's hearing, though. It is so very easy to condemn, said he, continuing the thread of his thoughts. I know no life that must be so delicious as that of a writer for newspapers, or a leading member of the opposition, to thunder forth accusations against men in power, show up with the worst side of everything that is produced, to pick holes in every coat, and be indignant, sarcastic, jocose, moral, or supercilious, to damn with faint praise or crush with open calumny. What can be so easy as this when the critic has to be responsible for nothing? You condemn what I do, but put yourself in my position and do the reverse, and then see if I cannot condemn you. Oh, Mr. Arabin, I do not condemn you. Pardon me, you do, Mrs. Bold, you as one of the world. You are now the opposition member. You are now composing your leading article, and well and bitterly you do it. And then he starts to describe the leading article. It's a little bit of semi-serious fun he's having, imagining her as an editorial writer. Let dogs delight to bark and bite, you fitly begin with an eloquent quotation. And if we are to have a church at all, in heaven's name, let the pastors who preside over it keep their hands from each other's throats. Lawyers can live without befouling each other's names. Doctors do not fight duels. Why is it that clergymen alone should indulge themselves in such unrestrained liberty of abuse against each other? And so you go on reviling us for our ungodly quarrels, our sectarian propensities, and the scandalous differences. It will, however, give you no trouble to write another article next week in which we, or some of us, shall be twitted with an unseemly apathy in matters of our vocation. It will not fall on you to reconcile the discrepancy. Your readers will never ask you how the poor parson is to be urgent in season and out of season, and yet never come in contact with men who he thinks widely differently from him. You, when you condemn this foreign treaty or that official arrangement, will have to incur no blame for the graver faults of any different measure. It is so easy to condemn, and so pleasant, too, for eulogy charms no listeners as detraction does. Eleanor only half followed him in his raillery, but she caught his meaning. I know I ought to apologize for presuming to criticize you, she said, but I was thinking that with sorrow of the ill will that has lately come among us at Barchester, and I spoke more freely than I should have done. Peace on earth and goodwill among men are, like heaven, promises for the future, said he, following rather his own thoughts than hers. He's mainly thinking out loud, in front of her. When that prophecy is accomplished, there will no longer be any need for clergymen. Here they were interrupted by the archdeacon, whose voice was heard from the cellar, shouting to the vicar, Arabin, Arabin, and then turning to his wife, who was apparently at his elbow, Where has he gone to? This cellar is perfectly abominable. It would be murder to put a bottle of wine into it till it had been roofed, walled, and floored. How on earth old Goodenough ever got on with it, I cannot guess, but then Goodenough never had a glass of wine that any man could drink. What is it, Archdeacon? Said the new vicar, running downstairs and leaving Eleanor above to her meditations. This cellar must be roofed, walled, and floored, repeated the Archdeacon. Now mind what I say, and don't let the architect persuade you that it will do. Half of these fellows know nothing about wine. This place, as it is now, would be damp and cold in winter and hot and muggy in summer. I wouldn't give a straw for the best wine that was ever vinted after it lain here a couple of years. You're supposed to be jarred by the contrast between the high theological debating that was just going on and the Archdeacon of Barchester, who's only concerned about whether or not the cellar is good for wine. Mr. Arabin assented and promised that the cellar should be reconstructed according to the Archdeacon's receipt. And Arabin, look here, was such an attempt at a kitchen grate ever seen? The grate is really very bad, said Mrs. Grantley. I am sure the priestess won't approve of it when she is brought home to the scene of her future duties. Really, Mr. Arabin, no priestess accustomed to such an excellent well as above could put up with such a grate as this. She's still trying to have her way with a little bit of raillery. You can almost view it, if you read between the lines, as her trying to soften her husband's criticism. If there must be a priestess at St. Ewald's at all, Mrs. Grantley, I think we will leave her to her well and not call down her divine wrath on any of the imperfections arising from our human poverty. However, I own I am amenable to the attractions of a well-cooked dinner, and the grate must certainly be changed. By this time the Archdeacon had again ascended, and was now in the dining room. Arabin, said he, speaking in his usual loud, clear voice, and with that tone of dictation which was so common to him, you must positively alter this dining room. That is, remodel it altogether. Look here, it is just 16 feet by 15. Did anybody ever hear of a dining room of such proportions? And the Archdeacon stepped the long ways round and crossways of ponderous steps, as though a certain amount of ecclesiastical dignity could be imparted even to such an occupation as that by the manner of doing it. Barely 16, you may call it a square. It would do very well for a round table, suggested the ex-warden, that's Mr. Harding, stepping in it right away. As you're going to see. But that's horrifying to Archdeacon Grantley. Now, there was something peculiarly unorthodox in the Archdeacon's estimation in the idea of a round table. He had always been accustomed to a goodly board of decent length, comfortably elongating itself according to the number of guests, nearly black with perpetual rubbing and as bright as a mirror. Now, round dinner tables are generally of oak, or else of such new construction as not to have acquired a peculiar hue which is so pleasing to him. His connection with them, with what he called the nasty, newfangled method of leaving a cloth on the table, as though to warn people that they were not to sit long. In his eyes there was something democratic and parvenu in a round table. He imagined that the centers and calico printers chiefly used them, and perhaps a few literary lions more conspicuous for their wit than their gentility. He was a little flurried as to the idea of such an article being introduced into the diocese by a protege of his own, and at the instigation of his own father-in-law. A round dinner table, said he, with some heat, is the most abominable article of furniture that was ever invented. I hope that Arabin has more taste than to allow such a thing in his house. Poor Mr. Harding felt himself completely snubbed, and of course said nothing further. But Mr. Arabin, who had yielded submissively in the small matters of the cellar and the kitchen grate, found himself obliged to oppose reforms which might be of a nature too expensive for his pocket. But it seems to me, Archdeacon, that I can't very well lengthen the room without pulling down the wall. And if I pull down the wall, I must build it up again. And then if I throw out a bow on this side, I must do the same on the other. And then if I do it on the ground floor, I must carry it up to the floor above. That will be putting a new front on the house, and it will cost, I suppose, a couple of £100. The ecclesiastical commissioners will hardly assist me when they hear that my grievance consists of having a dining room only 16 feet long. In other words, where is he going to get the money? A couple of £100. We'll get surveyors to come out to your house just to look at it. That's all that money will pay for now, if you want that kind of an addition on your front parlor. £200 will be what it costs to get them to come out and look at it. Not to touch anything, just to look with their eyes. That's all. The job itself, £100,000. Anyway, the Archdeacon proceeded to explain that nothing would be easier than adding 6 feet to the front of the dining room without touching any other room in the house. Such irregularities of construction in small country houses were, he said, rather graceful than otherwise, and he offered to pay for the whole thing out of his own pocket if it cost more than £40. Mr. Arabin, however, was firm, and although the Archdeacon fussed and fumed about it, would not give way. £40, he said, was a matter of serious moment to him and his friends, if under such circumstances they would be good-natured enough to come to him at all, must put up with the misery of a square room. He was willing to compromise matters by disclaiming any intention of having a round table. But, said Mrs. Grantley, what if the priestess insists on having both rooms enlarged? The priestess in that case must do it herself, Mrs. Grantley. I have no doubt she will be well able to do so, replied the lady, to do that and many more wonderful things. I'm quite sure that the priestess of St. Ewald, when she does come, won't come empty-handed. Here she's probably talking about a wife for Mr. Arabin, not just the ghostly lady at the well. Mr. Arabin, however, did not appear well inclined to enter into speculative expenses on such a chance as this, and therefore any material alterations in the house, the cost of which would not be fairly made to lie at the feet of either the ecclesiastical commissioners or the estate of the late incumbent, were tabooed. With this essential exception, the Archdeacon ordered, suggested, and carried all points before him in a manner very much to his own satisfaction. A close observer, had there been one there, might have seen that his wife had been quite as useful in the matter as himself. No one knew better than Mrs. Grantley the appurtenances necessary to a comfortable house. She did not, however, think it necessary to lay claim to any of the glory which her lord and master so readily appropriated as his own. Having gone through their work effectually and systematically, the party returned to Plumstead well satisfied with their expedition. So that is chapter 21, and that is our characters going out to Mr. Arabin's new living. He is now the rector of St. Ewald's. He's going to live in this house, and it's natural for a newcomer to think about knocking on the floors and the windows and the chimney flues to see what kinds of improvements it needs. The understanding being that a newbring will always want to do this. That's the bulk of the chapter, but something remarkable does happen in this chapter. And I'm sure that you noticed it yourself. That conversation between Eleanor Bold and Mr. Arabin, or really the way he lets himself think out loud around her when they're in private, is remarkable. We haven't seen anything like that in this book so far. All the characters in this book some of them have twists and turns to them, odd stories. They can be odd characters. Mr. Slope is an odd character. Lusignor Neroni is an odd character. Most of the Stanhopes are odd. But there hasn't been any depth. None of the characters in here, even including Mr. Harding, who is simply a saint, which is a pretty shallow character, there hasn't been any depth in any of the characters so far. Until we get to Mr. Arabin, that little semi-soliloquy that he delivers to or in front of Eleanor Bold is like nothing we've seen in the book so far. And I think it's pretty interesting. And maybe Eleanor found it interesting too. We certainly know that she liked it. She liked hearing a clergyman talk this way about actual clerical matters. So they went out to St. Ewald's from Plumstead Episcopate. They examined it. They had a talk going there. A few issues were raised, but that is the important thing in this chapter. And now they're back home at Plumstead Episcopi, and the novel will continue from there. So we will move on to the next chapter next time, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.